We are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us once again from Marseille, France, is our good friend Cole Stangler. Cole is a journalist and author who's been covering the recent series of French labor uprisings, which is a topic of great interest to us for a variety of reasons. So without any further ado, Cole, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, as always, RJ.
Always great to talk to you. And this is, your backgrounder piece on this in The Nation, which was published a couple weeks ago. The headline they gave it was "France's pension reform battle will be decided in the streets," which immediately made me think of 1968 and the situationists in France and beauty is in the streets and all that. But basically, in terms of background, let us know. But I think the President there, Macron, is trying to cut the retirement system, and workers are pushing back, right?
Yeah, and I guess to start off the bat with to make the parallels to May 68, I was at the demonstration the other day here in Marseille, and someone had these banners have been, I think, elsewhere in France as well. A banner that said, "If you give us 64, we'll give you 68," and it was sort of these pensioners that were holding up the
because
banners,
of age 64, right? Because
exactly,
they want to raise it from 62 to 64.
Exactly. The proposal here that's been put forward by the government would raise the retirement eligibility age, the earliest age at which you can leave with full retirement benefits for most of the population, from age 62, where it is now, up to age 64. That would become the new threshold for most workers. And then in addition to that, it's a little more complicated, but it's also part of the reform, is it would accelerate the phase-in of a new minimum amount of contribution years in order to access your pension, which is set at 43 years. That 43-year threshold comes in earlier. Without getting into too many of the details, it means in practice that for a lot of people, they're not even going to be able to retire at age 64, which is that minimum floor, but actually it's probably going to be a little bit later than that, because they have to have paid into the system for that minimum amount of 43 years. So in some cases, 65, 66. If you started later, your career, you might be retiring at age 67. A lot of the people I know, if you don't have a stable career paying in from the very beginning, you're going to be retiring later at 67 anyways, which is the age at which you can get a full pension, if you haven't already started obtaining your pension. I say all this to give more background, because I think it's important to note that it's not as if everyone in France today is, immediately just retiring at age 62. There's been a number of reforms in the system that have pushed the effective retirement age even higher, and it's already projected to rise even without this reform. But yeah, to get back to that initial question, what this reform would do would hike that floor from 62 to 64, and in practice, push that effective retirement age even higher than 64 for a lot of people.
And I just want to stay with this for a second, Cole, before we get to the fun stuff, which is the labor actions, because I think it's important for people to understand this is a standard, in my opinion, a standard play of this kind of, forgive the overused word, of sort of neoliberal reductions in worker benefits and wages and so on, is, first of all, to call it reform instead of cutting, because reform is associated with good things, right? And then secondly, there'll be these numbers games where, okay, if the minimum retirement age is raised from 62 to 64. There are a lot of people here in this country thinking, those lucky French, they're bitching if they get to retire at 64. But okay, 64 minus 43 is 21. So you have to, if you go to graduate school, you can't retire at 64. If you're, as you say, unemployed for a year or two or more throughout your career, you can't retire at 64. If you're, we could go on, but that's the gist of it. And, it reminds me of what's been done here, where people say the U.S. retirement age is 65. It's being scaled up to 66. And you don't get full benefits until you're 70. These numbers games, I think, are really important because I think people get fooled by them. And I think that one of the interesting things about the labor movement in France is that they don't seem to be fooled by them.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things that just to point out, I think that are important to contextualize. Compared to the US, there's one very, very big difference, which is that in France, people do not tend to have supplemental private pensions that they're getting. They don't have other funds that they're accessing at their retirement. The vast majority of people have been paying into the system their entire life, and in a lot of money also that they're paying into the system coming out of their salary, because France does spend a lot on retirement. It's sort of part of the social contract. People have been paying into this system expecting to get benefits, and it's for the vast majority of the population, overwhelming majority, and even more so when you get to lower income people, this is their source of retirement. There isn't really a plan B. So this is what people do when they finish working. And I think that's an important kind of point to just to emphasize here, where we're talking about the differences. So this is the system everyone's going to be benefiting from. And the other point is, this reform, if you think of it in that sense, I mean, it's going to hurt people who are the lowest paid workers, people that are at the end of their careers today. As the phase-in period presumably takes effect, if this reform does pass, you have people that have been expecting to retire, be able to start accessing their benefits at age 62. They might be, 57 years old, 56 years old, in blue collar work. Let's say they're, a janitor, a home care aide. They've been paying into the system. They've done everything right. And now the government's saying, hold on, you're going to have to wait 2 more years because, this is the rule that we have. It's going to penalize people working at the beginning of their careers as well. People starting in the early phases. So it's a reform that hits blue collar workers harder, service workers harder. These are also people that have lower life expectancy as well. Right. The life expectancy is I think I don't want to get my numbers off here, but I think a 6-year gap if you're looking at the white collar professional workers versus blue collar workers. So you have a life expectancy gap as well. Already, they're not getting those benefits as much as higher paid workers. So you have a lot of inequality embedded into this. And then the other thing really to keep in mind, I said at the beginning, this is the system that people have been paying their whole lives into. There isn't really a plan B for most people.
Yeah, and worth also adding to all of those great points that of course, blue collar workers, service workers are the ones who wear out their bodies, have the most demanding physical jobs by and large. So asking a waitress who's on her feet 8 hours a day to work several more years is not like asking a senior executive, one of the corporations backing Macron to work an extra couple of years. It's, among other things, far more physically demanding on an aging body. So that's a factor too, I would think.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, and this is also a system that's effective too. It costs a lot of money. I think France spends around 14% of its GDP on pension benefits, which you could say, okay, that's high, but it's also a very effective system. France has one of the lowest rates of senior poverty among all OECD countries. I think it's just below Denmark for the lowest level of old age poverty. So better, obviously, than the US, better than the UK, better even than Germany, which France sometimes gets compared to. Germany as sort of the model European economy, better than Sweden. So lower rates of senior poverty. It also France has a very high level of, without getting too much into details here, what's called the net replacement rate. So they have a higher rate of, the benefits that retirees are getting are a very high portion of the salaries that they've been earning over the course of their careers. I think it's something around 74%, which is also one of the highest levels in the OECD, meaning your retirement benefits are around 74% of what you were earning over the course of your career. So a very high level as well. It's an effective system. It works. And so those are other important points to keep in mind when you're thinking about, well, why are so many people upset? Because clearly, this move here has upset a lot of people, and it's pushing a lot of people into the streets.
Yeah, and before we get into the action on the streets, because I think in terms of context, it's helpful to talk about someone you interviewed not too long ago, Francois Rufa, who is a filmmaker, now a member of parliament, interesting guy. And in his interview with you, I thought he made a lot of terrific points. He had people call him the Michael Moore of France, which I can see because he started off founding an alternative newspaper. Then he made a satirical documentary, Thanks Boss, Merci Patron. And he also, you say, helped launch the Nuit debout movement, which means what? Get up at night, and it's kind of an Occupy for France. He's been in the National Assembly for 5 years as part of La France Insoumise, the left-wing group. And I found your interview with him in Jacobin extremely interesting. I thought he had, I found myself wishing we had someone this articulate. And obviously we have Bernie and a few people, but I thought he put the issues in a great context. I was very impressed by him. Were you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think he's a very effective politician, and I think for instance, if you look at the way that he speaks about pensions and retirement, I think he does it in a pretty good way. I mean, this is the case that Ruffin's been making, among others, but I think Ruffin makes the case very well. Is that this is really what this battle is fundamentally, is something that the labor movement has been fighting for really since its inception, which is the question of when do you have time off from work? I mean, if you think back to the beginning of capitalism and sort of the what was going on in the 19th century, you think of Manchester in England and other big kind of capitalist towns at the beginning, where people are working on the weekends. There's no time off at all on the weekends, and the movement had to fight. You had child labor. The movement had to fight for children to have the right off from work. They had to fight for Sundays off. They had to fight for Saturdays off. They had to fight for reduced working hours, and then they had to fight for retirement, which is to say, at a certain point, you stop working because you put in enough time. And so Rufa has a way of speaking about this, where this is really a question of, who owns that time that you have? Does it belong to you and your family and your friends, or does it belong to the people that want to keep making you work longer? And I think that's why people are upset too, is, this is the government basically saying, yeah, you know what? Too bad. I don't want to use correct language here. Too bad for you. You're going to have to keep working in the workforce and stick around for a couple more years. So it touches this more fundamental question. And that's why the left has been very animated by this whole question. It's something the left has fought for in France. If you look back at the history of the pension system, it was set up after World War II, in that little brief moment in which France had a provisional government in place with de Gaulle, in which the communists were part of this coalition, and you had a communist labor minister who was the main architect of the French social security system, which included retirement. So you have this, communist labor minister associated with it. You then have in the 1980s, when the French Socialist Party finally conquered the presidency for the first time in the history of the Fifth Republic in 1982, Francois Mitterrand, the president at the time, 1981 here. But I think maybe that reform was the following. In any case, Mitterrand, when he comes to power, lowers the retirement age to age 60, and it's seen as sort of this continuation of this broader history I was talking about of various victories for the labor movement and sort of progress, social progress more broadly speaking. And so these are these symbolic victories as well that are very real, but are also hold a lot of symbolic importance. That the right in France, conversely, has been obsessed with chipping away at, undermining, and ultimately, knocking down. Nicolas Sarkozy raised the retirement age from 60 to 62. For as long as Macron has been in office, there's been talk of when he's going to finally attack this issue of pension reform, and for them on the right, this is a very important issue as well. I was mentioning the left, the importance of pension, of keeping, of this pension system broadly speaking. On the right, there's this ideological obsession with reforming, quote unquote, reforming pensions, cutting pensions. They think it takes up too much GDP. And so it's almost this sort of perverse test of political courage of, are you really going to be able to be tough enough to get this reform done? And I'll leave you just with one quote that to illustrate this point. Edouard Philippe, the former prime minister of Macron, said something to the effect of, well, the Americans have their guns, the English, they have Ireland, and we have pension reform. So from the mentality of the right in France, this is seen as really, it's kind of this sort of bugaboo issue that it's always kind of nagging at them, and they want to get it done. And Macron is now moving forward with it. I think it's important just to stress that ideologically, it's very important for the right too. We often talk about the left and how it wants to defend and it's being stubborn, etc. The right is ideologically obsessed with this issue as well.
You can have your pension when you pry it from my cold, dead hands. And I think that's great context, Cole. And I think there's, Macron to me is an interesting figure in all of this because he's very, it seems to me, he presents himself in a very Bill Clinton-esque way as I'm neither left nor right, kind of technocratic. I just want things to work efficiently, which of course is ideology. And again, Francois Rufa had a good quote. He's referencing the old saying that the anti-communist left used to use, we're offering socialism with a human face. He said of Macron, it's Thatcherism, meaning, the right-wing former prime minister of UK, it's Thatcherism with a baby face because Macron is young. So, but to me, that is a sort of centrist, a so-called third way that actually, to me, that leans right. And, but as with the right, you prove your toughness, quote unquote, by cutting pensions or some other aspect of the social contract. And, I'm wondering to what extent this sort of technocratic, self-characterized center, buys into this right framing that this is a proof of toughness.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think what's one of the things that's interesting about this debate is that I think well, it depends where you're coming from, but I think from a sort of mainstream, even liberal economic point of view, the French pension system, like I said, it costs a lot of money. People's salaries are they're high payroll taxes that are funding the system, but it's not exactly facing a crisis either. Macron commissioned, there's a government commission on retirement that is obligated to do reports and look into the future of the system and the financial stability of the system, and they project a deficit to emerge. It's something like, I think, 12 billion euros, which sounds like a lot, but when you consider the amount of money that's being spent on this, it's not huge either. And they also expect the system in their projections to potentially recover that deficit, depending on the projections in 15 or 20 years, which is to say that the argument that this is move to the system is on the brink of collapse doesn't really stand up, and it's not even, and it's been awkward even for Macron as he's tried to navigate this, because this council on pension reform hasn't really been playing along, so to speak. They haven't been saying the pension system is in a situation of crisis. They expect it actually to recover, like I said. So from that point of view, it's not the system is not on the brink of collapse. But as others have pointed out, and I think I think this is perhaps the more compelling of the arguments, is that Macron's general economic program has premised on not raising taxes. It's premised on lowering taxes, lowering spending. And so if you want to be able to finance these other measures and finance your agenda, this is a great place to unlock some savings, because it's costs a whole lot of money to maintain. And it's something that European countries are obligated to submit their budget plans to the European Commission in advance. In France's filing last year, they reference the savings that are going to be unlocked from pension reform. It's referenced in another budget the government put forward in the fall. They expect this measure to finance their agenda, which is, sorry for this sort of long-winded answer, RJ, but what I'm trying to say is that I think there's a compelling case to be made that this move right here is less about saving the pension system that's not actually on the brink of collapse, and more about financing a supply side vision of running the economy and running social spending. And again, this is a great place to find savings to do that, if you think like that.
Right, of course, because it's a large number. People have paid into it, though, because that's how it became a large number. As also with, not to overstress the parallels with the United States, because there are many differences, but as with the United States, Social Security and Medicare, people have paid a lot for it, so it didn't drop out of the sky. So that gets us to the labor movement and what they're doing about it. It sounds like labor actions, which we've seen in the past, are increasing or accelerating. What's the current situation in terms of labor action against what Macron is trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, we saw two of the biggest protests that France has seen in decades. Just over the course of the last couple of weeks. January 19th, over 1 million people protesting across France. Those are the police numbers. There's this constant battle of the police versus the union numbers. The most recent big day of national protest that we saw, which was on Tuesday, the 31st of January, even higher number, 1.27 million people, according to the police. If you take the police number, not even the union number, which is 2.8 million, if you take the police number, that's the highest, the biggest protest, single day protest in France in 3 decades, bigger than the 2010 pension reform protest, bigger than 2003, bigger even than the 1995 strikes. So one of the biggest national protests really in history. To give more context, I think that the biggest was the demonstrations after Charlie Hebdo in 2015, over 3 million. But still, okay, 1.27 million people protesting on that second day of action. You had strikes affecting a number of sectors: the transit sector, the national rail system, the health system, education as well. And so now you have a couple of other days of action, national days of action, which are strikes and protests that are slated for the beginning of February next week. So 2 more of these days of strikes and protests. And I think what's interesting is you have united unions, the first time that you've had a united union coalition working together in quite some time. You have not only the CGT, which is the more militant left-wing union tied to the Communist Party historically, you have the more moderate CFDT union, which has said, if you raise the pension, the retirement eligibility age, it's a red line. It's we're gonna strike. And so that's why the CFDT moderate union is backing the strikes as well. So you've had these big days of action, more to come. I think they've caught the government off guard. When Macron was unveiling this reform, they knew it would spark some protest, but they were essentially gambling that on the fact that people would be too tired, that maybe the unions would be sort of isolated from the rest of the population. And in fact, that's not what's happened. The protests have clearly attracted people beyond just the sort of traditional union base. You can see that in the numbers of people that have come out to the protests. You can see that in a number of sectors that have been affected by the strikes as well. And you can see that in the polling as well. The polling is quite staggering on this. It's around 7 in 10 people are against the hike in the retirement age that's being proposed. So you have a movement that's one of the biggest movements we've seen in decades in France. You have polling and public opinion that is on the side of the unions against the government, and you have the government saying right now, sorry, this is not, well, sorry, they're not saying sorry. They're saying this is not negotiable. We're sticking with this proposed hike in the retirement age. And you have this kind of this showdown now. The prime minister said, again, repeated just a few days ago that this is not negotiable, the proposed hike from 62 to 64. So what's going to happen is the question. And it's hard to say, because Macron has now staked so much of his his second term now is he's gone all in on this pension reform, which frankly, I think I've said this to you before. We've talked about this. I don't even quite understand it from their point of view, if this is really worth it, because from the Macronist standpoint, you're now getting into pretty tricky, very tricky terrain. So their hope is that the protests will sort of
dissipate or something. Yeah,
will dissipate and calm down, and then eventually, they'll work their way in Parliament. But even that isn't assured. We don't know if they can. Well, it depends. It depends on what the situation can be in Parliament. But I think that's something to look out for as well. Do they have the votes to be able to get this done within their own camp?
So, this is a huge action, a huge set of protests. It seems somewhere between your typical strike and a general strike. It's not a full general strike, but a lot of people are coming out. What sectors you mentioned education, you mentioned the rail system. What other types of labor are participating in these? Because I assume these are not only protests, they're in effect one-day strikes. Is that fair? So who's participating?
Yeah, and they often get you have a big chunk of it has been the sort of bastion of organized labor in France, which is the public sector. School teachers, very high numbers. I think around a quarter, according to the government. Primary school teachers were on strike on the most recent day of action. So public schools is a big chunk of it. The national railway system is a big chunk of it. Individual transit systems across the country. In Paris, certainly. People have been walking out in the Marseille system. You've had a lot of participation. You look at the energy sector as well, where unions are quite strong. I think we've talked about this before, but if the refinery strikes that happened in September, you have heavy participation at the country's oil refineries. You also have participation among at EDF, which is the operator of the state's grid, really, and the nuclear power sector. You have people walking off the job. Those are sort of the places where organized labor is strongest. And I think one of the things to look for as things continue, without trying to make too bold of predictions, but if the movement's going to have success in the long run, we're going to see more and more participation in strikes from these parts of the economy that where unions aren't so strong typically. And there's some evidence of that. If you look at just on the 31st, there were 5,000 people that walked out at Airbus. The big aeronautic company, even on the European level. So 5,000 people at Airbus. I was reading reports of, people walking out at a like Mondelez owned like cookie factory in Normandy. You have dock workers as well, which I should put in the category of bastions of organized labor. Here in Marseille, the union is quite powerful here. So you had a huge walkout from dock workers. I was reading something about workers building mobile homes that walked off the job. So you have these sort of little pockets of things happening in the private sector. And I think that's something that could be really interesting is this sort of movement expanding beyond the traditional sources of strength? So are we seeing strikes in those other private sector, parts of the economy? And are we seeing protests outside of the big cities? So far, the answer has been yes. And that's something that's also caught the government off guard. When you see, thousands of people turning up in small towns in the center of France, that feels sort of yellow vest-ish, and it's not something that the government quite anticipated. So those are two kind of interesting things to look for as things move ahead.
Now, this might be different in different cities and towns, but the ones you've seen, the protests you've seen, what's the mood like? Is it grim? Is it determined? Is it celebratory, or is there any general mood at all?
Yeah, I mean, I've been to the two ones here in Marseille, so I think that probably influences. That's what I've seen. But I think the first one, there was a sense of, okay, people thought, maybe this was going to be big, but they weren't quite sure, and so I think there was a sort of hesitancy and kind of a realization that, well, actually, this is pretty significant. And then I think there was a different mood at the most recent one on Tuesday, where it was, first off, just much bigger, and secondly, it seemed like there was a more festive kind of celebratory atmosphere, with like, funny signs and lots of kids. And I'm speaking about the one in Marseille. I think if you talk to people if you talk to people in Paris at the front lines with the Black Bloc, maybe they'll give you a different answer. But it felt very festive, and it felt like everybody was there, and it was a huge turnout. I hadn't seen anything like that since I've been here. So the question is, will it be able to hold here into next week? That's something that the government is banking on is the sort of generalized fatigue. So
and any sense yet, Cole, of the economic impact these are having? Is it something that's beginning to register in the economic indicators that might raise concerns with the government?
I haven't seen anything to that effect. I think if it continues,
might be too soon. Yeah, it might be too soon. So we don't know what's coming next, right? We'll just have to. It feels like a battle of wills between the labor movement and the government, right?
And I think one really interesting thing to look for is okay, the government, maybe they can decide to be humiliated, concede, and back off the reform. That's one option. But I think another option, which can kind of lead to the same outcome, if you're following this, is it's not the Macron needs to have the support of his own deputies, and there have been reports that you have a handful of them that are saying they're not willing to vote for this reform. You have a handful of people telling journalists, not get anonymously, but you've had a couple of reports to this effect. People in his own party saying that they're not willing to support this in its current phase. Again, just a handful at this point, I think around 10 to 15. And then also people in the nominally the right-wing party, the Républicains, which Macron is relying on to govern. You have around similar numbers in that party that are supposedly expressing reservations about this, because I think they look at the protests, they look at the polls, and they think to themselves, does this really make a lot of sense for our party to be associated with this? And so what happens if you get to a situation in which you have open revolt within not just the right-wing party, but a lot of doubt within Macron's own party? That could potentially undermine the government's ability to get the reform done. But they also, of course, have this important constitutional weapon that they've deployed before, which is the infamous Article 49.3, which allows them to essentially pass legislation without a vote. It can only be overturned if the assembly votes for a motion of no confidence against the government. So they could potentially resort to that article to overcome parliamentary obstruction. But again, I mean, is that politically feasible in a situation in which you have mass protests, huge popular opposition within your own ranks, and then you decide to use your weapons to essentially ram it through? That's not great politics. So
no, only if you're Macron, you're planning to retire to the private sector, burn your party down to do it, cash in, so you're going to upgrade your collection of turtlenecks. That's the only logic I could see behind it. I wish I could be sure that wasn't the case. But in any case, Cole Stangler, as a journalist who covers labor, you certainly picked an interesting time to move to France, and you got a lot to cover there. You're doing a fantastic job of it. So I encourage people to track down. Where's your Patreon? I know you have a Patreon, right?
I do. It's you can. I think it's just with my name. So patreon.com/Cole Stangler. I think just with my name.
Okay, Stangler, right?
And I'm always glad for you have such interest in covering French political issues. So always glad.
Well, it's so important and interesting. And who knows? Maybe the U.S. labor movement will be inspired. In any case, Cole Stangler, journalist and author based in France. Thanks for the great coverage, the great writing, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.